Bienvenidos. This is the second study in our series, Loving God with All of Our Heart, and it forms part of a larger series, Loving God with all of our heart, with all of our soul, with all of our mind, and with all of our strength. And as we saw in the last study, the beginning of the series, Jesus is inviting us to love God as our perfect Father. And coming to love God, heart, soul, mind, and strength is a journey. It's a journey that will transform us from the inside out. And we saw last time in the parable that Jesus taught about the lost son, a brief sketch, a glimpse of what this journey might be like. We saw what alienates us from the Father, selfishness, and what can bring us back to Him, unconditional love. And if this invitation touches something deep inside of us, or wakens our curiosity, then before beginning, we need to check our faith. Because how can we imagine having such a close relationship with the Creator of the universe if we have doubts about His existence? Plus, the journey of transformation will have a lot of challenges to it. And in those moments of challenge, we're going to have to reevaluate our faith and fortify it. For that reason, we're calling this study now, First, Fortify Your Faith. Why do you believe? I hope you don't mind me asking you. Because it's not really a private matter. Because our belief, our faith, really affects how we treat other people. And so we need to be ready to give an answer, a reason why we believe. In fact, this is what the Apostle Peter wrote about in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. Let's read that. He says, "But in your hearts respect Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope you have. But do this with gentleness and respect," to give a reason, to give a defense of why we believe what we believe. Be surprised how many people have told us that the reason why they believe in God is because their grandmother, their grandparents, their parents brought them up believing. But the faith of your grandparents or your parents is not going to support you all along the journey of transformation to come to love God, heart, soul, mind, and strength, especially during the difficult times. Other people have said, well, I believe because God has blessed me so much. But that's really circular reasoning, because how do you know it was really God who blessed you? And what would you say to people who have not been as blessed as you are, people who have suffered greatly in life and been abandoned in some ways? What would you explain to them how they could come to believe in God? Other people just feel like God must exist. Just a while ago, somebody told me this recently. The reason why they believe in God is because, well, they just feel like there must be a God. But feelings change throughout our life. And whatever the reasons we have for believing in God, they have to be available to everyone. Other people don't have my same feelings. So whatever evidence there is for believing that God exists has to be available to everyone in an equal way. And the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 1, verse 20 gives an idea to us about what this evidence looks like. In Romans chapter 1, verse 20, he says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." So essentially, Paul is telling us that we are surrounded by reasons to believe. We are surrounded by things that are made, and things that are made require a creator or a designer. Let me give you some examples, for instance. A really simple example. Some time ago, I went hiking, backpacking with my oldest grandson. We started on the coast of California and walked into a canyon and found a site along a river underneath some huge redwood trees. And there in the middle of this forest was a picnic table. And of course, we could assume that someone came and brought the materials to that place and built that picnic table. We can assume that somebody was there before we were. After all, a picnic table is a fairly complex structure. It contains 15 or 16 different pieces of wood put together by screws or nails. And it indicates somebody was there who had will to do it, the desire to do it, the capacity, the ability to build it, and the materials that were sufficient to build it. It's a message. The existence of the picnic table there in the middle of that forest near the river was a message from somebody saying, I was here. In fact, on top of the table, on the surface of the table, were lots of initials of different names of people carved in the top of the table. Some more evidence of people saying, we were here too. Well, here's another example. I've gone several times to Tabasco, Mexico, where there are some really beautiful archaeological ruins of the Mayan people who lived hundreds of years ago. When you look at those ruins, of course, they are made up of stones that were carved and fashioned in a certain way and used to build very intricate structures. And when you look at those structures and those carved stones, the whole circumstance of the ruin itself is a message from the Mayan people that says, we were here. It had to be built by somebody who had the ability, the power to build it, the desire to build it, who existed before the actual carved materials did, who in fact carved the materials. And these people, they had to be people or beings with will or desire and capacity, had to have had a different nature than the stones themselves. In other words, they could not have been objects themselves. They had to be beings with a different level of existence than the mere stones that they used to build the pyramids. Here's another example. You've seen probably the letters, the plastic letters with magnets on the back of them that people stick on the doors of refrigerators to form little messages. Say one day you go by the door of the refrigerator and it says on the door, buy more peanut butter. That's a message. It consists of 19 letters arranged in a very specific manner. And those letters are a code, really, that your eyes can read and your brain can interpret, that communicates a language through a language and communicates a message to you. The message, of course, is buy more peanut butter. But the message is also, I was here, whoever it was, your spouse, your children, your parents. Somebody put the message there. Somebody is saying, I was here and I want you to buy more peanut butter. Well, the amazing thing is that in every cell of the human body and of other living organisms, there is a message. And that message is written in a code, in a language that consists of 4 letters repeated 3 billion times. A word, a phrase that consists of 3 billion letters. When you eat protein, like peanut butter or meat or milk, you drink milk or you eat Cocoa Puffs, even Cocoa Puffs have a gram of protein in every cup. Your stomach digests the protein and breaks it up into its component parts. Proteins are made up of amino acids, which are complex molecules in themselves, and breaks up those proteins into different amino acids. Your body uses 21 different kinds of amino acids to form proteins. And so those amino acids that are broken up in your stomach, the proteins that are broken up into amino acids in your stomach, are absorbed, and then your body reassembles those amino acids into different proteins that your body needs. Your body needs 50,000 different kinds of proteins to make skin, hair, muscles, to help blood coagulate. And proteins themselves are made up of hundreds of amino acids, hundreds of these 21 amino acids. in a very complex shape, form. I want you to think of an example, a comparison. Think of the Lego blocks, the little tiny Lego blocks that kids use to build structures, houses, buildings, trucks, even spaceships. Think of building a structure out of Legos, these little tiny blocks, that has hundreds of pieces. What would you need to be able to build that? Whatever it is. Say you're building a big truck. You would need some instructions that help you know which pieces to put together in which order to form the structure you're looking for, that you want to build. Say you've got to build 50,000 different structures with Legos. You're going to be there a long time. You're going to need some instructions. Well, that's a question that's raised about proteins. They're broken up into amino acids. How does the body know how to reassemble those amino acids into different proteins when there are hundreds of these 21 amino acids in each protein? How does the body know how to reassemble them? Well, there's some instructions. The instructions for reassembling amino acids into the right proteins that your body can use is contained in DNA. And DNA is a double-stranded, a long molecule. DNA, human DNA, is about 6 feet long. If you can imagine a very, very thin chain of molecules running 6 feet long that contains 6 billion segments, 6 billion molecules arranged in a certain order. And there are 4 kinds of molecules in a DNA strand. And those 4 kinds of molecules carry 4 different letters as their indications. A, T, C, and G. And A, T, C, and G, those 4 molecules are arranged in repetitive patterns and different patterns in very specific orders to specify how and when and how much protein to make, of what kinds of protein. And along the strand of DNA, a certain number of molecules, a certain number of segments called bases form a gene. And a gene is a certain portion of the DNA that specifies instructions for making a protein. Imagine that. The DNA in every cell of your body contains instructions written in a code. And that code, that alphabet, A, T, C, and G, forms a language that the cell can understand and communicates instructions, a message, to other parts in the cell that can interpret that message and build the proteins. And there are no forces between those segments that demand that they are arranged in a certain order. They've been put in that order. They've been designed in that order. And the code, the language itself, had to have been designed because it existed since life began. Even the most simplest bacteria doesn't have 3 billion segments like in its DNA like human DNA does. The smallest bacteria has 160,000. But still, 160,000 is a lot more than 19 letters of Buy More peanut butter. That code, the language, and the message had to be the result of creative power, because it could not have created itself. And that creative power had to have existed before the DNA did. It had to have the power, in other words, the will, the material, the desire, the capacity, the intelligence to design it. And this creative power had to be of a different nature than the DNA itself, a different level of existence, just like it had to be people who made the picnic table or who carved the stones in the archaeological ruins of the Mayas. And you see, this is exactly what Paul says in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, when he says that The invisible qualities of God, his eternal power and his divine nature, can clearly be seen by what has been made. Eternal in the sense that the Creator existed before the creation, was powerful, that he had will, capacity, and resources to do it, and he has a different nature, a divine nature. That is, he's not human, he's not part of the creation itself, but he's distinct and a different level of existence. So, inside ourselves, we have a message. And that message is, I was here, I'm still here, and I will be here. But then later on in Romans, Paul says something very interesting about the heart and belief. I want you to read with me in Romans chapter 10, verse 9 and 10. This is where Paul says, where he connects faith with the heart. He says, beginning with Romans chapter 10, beginning with verse 9. If you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified. It is with your mouth that you confess your faith and are saved. Now, haven't we just shown that the evidence, the reason for believing in God, is an intellectual reason, reasons that are available to everyone? But now he says that faith comes from the heart. And the heart represents desires, emotions, values that motivate us. Is that to say that faith is something emotional? Well, what's the connection between faith and the heart? Well, the truth is that our emotions can affect the way we look at evidence. Our emotions can form prejudices in favor of the evidence or against the evidence. Our emotions can discourage us from even looking at the evidence. That's why, for instance, in a court of law, when somebody who is accused is going to be tried by a jury and the lawyers have to select members for the jury, they ask a lot of questions of the potential members. And often those questions focus on the experience of those potential members to discover if they've been involved in a crime, a similar crime, if they've committed such a crime, if they have been accused and judged of having committed such a crime, or if they were victims of a similar crime. Because being a victim or having committed a crime that's similar would create prejudices in their minds, emotions that would flavor their ability to judge. And so if people did have these connections, they would be eliminated from the possible potential jurors, because they want somebody on the jury, they want people on the jury that will be unprejudiced and unmoved by their emotions. But the fact is, emotions can serve us well if they motivate us to begin to look at the evidence. Some emotions do that. For instance, if somebody's anxious or worried or confused about the purpose and meaning of life, or if they feel powerless, or if they feel alone, if they are afraid of the unknown, those kinds of emotions might motivate them to want to discover evidence. But even though, despite these motivations, when they finally consider the evidence will have to be reasonable. It will have to be something that's available to everyone, that could provide the grounds for believing that God really does exist. And this is really what we're trying to discover. We're not trying to discover right now whether God is our Father. We're just trying to discover whether there is a being who is powerful, eternal, and has creative capacity, who created what we see around us. And we have to be motivated to want to look at the evidence. Some emotions can keep people from looking at the evidence. Say, for instance, if they have a lot of pride and they just don't think they need God in their life. Or if they feel guilty for tremendous things that they've committed in their life. They may not want to think about God because they believe that by thinking about God would make them confront their guilt, and they don't want to. So they ignore it. Or perhaps they've just felt abandoned or suffered something, and if God were to exist, they would blame God for what they experienced. These are some things we'll talk about later in other studies. But the fact is, whatever emotions we have, whether they're in favor or against looking for the evidence of God, whatever emotions we have, they're not going to make God or the Creator, this creative being, disappear. And despite our emotions, if he exists, he'll continue to exist. And so, along this journey that we're taking, we're going to have to fortify our faith, because we are going to be faced with certain challenges. We might be faced with suffering at some point in our life. We might feel abandoned in some way. And in such moments, we're going to have to reevaluate our faith and fortify it. That's why I invite you first to fortify your faith with reasons that can give you the faith to continue the journey, to come to know God as your Father, and to love him with heart, soul, mind, and strength, and what that would mean for you. May God bless you.